And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for sticking with us. Kelly Roman's our guest. She is a park ranger at Fort Stanwix National Monument, and she's been a ranger up there since 2001. You look hardly old enough to have been a ranger up there since 2001.
Sometimes it is hard to believe. I started just a couple of days after high school in a seasonal position, back before the internet made these applications available far and wide, so I filled everything out on paper and turned it all in, and ended up getting hired by the end of the year as a permanent employee in a college internship position. And I've been there pretty much straight since then, with the exception of a few details here and there at other parks.
You know, you've got an advantage over many other park rangers in that you're a native of Rome. You've grown up with that history. You know that history. I feel bad for some of these rangers that come into Rome or go to somewhere else.
Oh, yeah.
And overnight, they've got to learn the history.
So my experience with that was in 2007, I spent a season at George Washington's birthplace, and I was one of the education rangers there. And it's almost the exact same story, the exact same time periods, just 1740s era. And it was super nerve-wracking to try to remember the details of George Washington's early life, even though I was a history person. I give credit to some of our newer rangers who cycle through during summer season. We've had botanists, we've had geologists, we've had history folks, we've had music folks, and all of them have put in the time and effort to learn the Fort Stanwix story and do amazing things with it. But yeah, it can be a little intimidating to expect to just know things immediately. I'd hope I'd be able to get my feet wet a little bit if I was stuck out in the middle of Yellowstone before I had to give a tour or something.
When you give a tour, Kelly, what is the most common kind of question you get?
Were there actually families here?
Were there families
How
there?
many people were here? Occasionally, what time frame is this? I can imagine there's so much American history, and yeah, I specialize in it, but I won't say how many more years since I've been a kid, but every time you have to learn a little bit more, it gets confusing for kids and adults even. Did George Washington ever visit here? That's a popular one, and he did once, but after the fort was abandoned. So,
and were there families at the fort?
There were families at the fort. They weren't allowed to live inside the fort. So then the question becomes, where did they live? And they actually lived in the ditch that surrounds the fort. Simply safer than being outside the fence area altogether.
And sometimes during the summer, there's tents set up outside in that ditch.
Yes.
Is that representing that?
Exactly.
And how many people were in the fort?
So in the fort itself, it was built to hold about 500 soldiers, and that would have been a combination of 400 to 450 regular soldiers, and then 75-ish to 50 officers, the people in charge. During the siege of 1777, there were actually 700 to 800 people jammed inside the walls of the fort. And as far as families are regularly concerned, they did keep track of the numbers. Those are records that have been lost to time, either in a fire in the Albany archives, they're buried in somebody's dusty drawer somewhere, waiting for their grandchildren to discover it. But those numbers have been lost to time. The only time we have an almost exact count of how many women or civilians were at the fort was during that siege. And depending on the records you read, there was either 3 to 8 women. And by the time the siege was done, there was either 4 to 9 women, because one of those women gave birth to a beautiful baby girl.
What about medical considerations for the people that were at the fort? Was there much care?
Yes and no. So 18th century medicine, very different than what we're used to. They don't know about germ theory. They believe in something called the humors. So you have different amounts of blood and phlegm and bile in your body, and if they get out of balance, that's what makes you ill. So one of the treatments of the day was trepanning, where they'd lance you and let all your blood drain out, or they'd put a leech on you and let it suck out slowly. And doctors weren't just doctors, they were doctors, barbers, dentists. So they were kind of jacks of all trades. And There's a little bit of a difference between how the Dutch and how the English view health. So the Dutch are cleaning up after themselves with vinegar if they can. They try to use hot water when they can. They don't know why it's keeping them healthy, but it does. So at the fort, there was that Dutch influence because the commanders of the fort were of Dutch descent. So there's a little bit less note of disease of any type spreading in Fort Stanwix, for instance, than say compared to in the larger Continental Army, where you're going to have to remind people where their restrooms are all the time, where they have to get their water all the time, where there's smallpox breaking out on a regular basis. So at the fort, people were taken care of by this doctor. Women were tasked with acting as nurses, which is simply keeping the area clean at the time, not necessarily actually hands-on nursing as we consider it today. And during that siege, there were about 40 people injured, and only 8 of those died. So the medical care had to have been at least decent enough to get them through that. And as I said, that included the woman who gave birth. She actually gave birth after being wounded in the thigh, having a giant chunk of her leg taken out by an exploding mortar. So her and her daughter survived, so the doctor had to have known what he was doing.
You mentioned Dutch commanders. Gansevoort was
Gansevoort,
one, right?
yes.
Gansevoort.
Yep,
Yeah.
Peter Gansevoort.
And was he in charge, or was he second in command?
He was the commandant. His second in command was Marinus Willett, and there's so many things across the valley named after Marinus Willett, and it's because Fort Stanwix he served at twice, once when he was a child, well, not a child, but a teenager during the French and Indian War, once during the Revolutionary War as the second in command, but he also was in charge of many of the forces that went through the valley area in the years following the siege of 1777. So he's involved in the campaign of 1779. He's involved in the fighting at West Canada Creek that eventually kills Walter Butler, one of the loyalists fighting for the Johnson family. He is everywhere. He ends up in New York City. He serves 1 or 2 terms as sheriff, a term as mayor, and becomes very lauded down there. But it seems like he was always stuck up here and never quite wanted to be. And I say he was the second in command, he was only 34-ish years old when the siege of 1777 happened. Peter Gansevoort was only 28. So I hear these things, and when I was 18, when I first started, 28 seemed like, oh, that's a far way away. I had to have been very wise. And now that I'm well past that, how did these people survive?
Kelly Roman's our guest. She's a ranger at Fort Stanwix National Monument. And Fort Stanwix is what we're talking about. Short break, right back.